Hey, it's me, Wetspork, and today I decided that I'd discuss the main theme behind my sort of approach to life in like a very brief way. To get to this point, I figured I'd develop on trying to examine nihilism and the point towards which it is certainly justifiable, but doesn't exactly do much to promote itself above any other isms. In doing so, I sort of hope to give you this conclusion that, upon assuming that the main point nihilism supposes is true, that whether you be religious, atheistic, agnostic, that this does nothing to diminish how you live your life. To actually get to the point that I'm trying to make, it's pretty fundamental to actually understand what nihilism is in the first place, so I'll give it my best surface knowledge interpretation. The leading main point behind nihilism is the conclusion that nothing has any inherent value, including human life. Because nothing has any value, human life, no matter how much we desire to live or experience, is entirely insignificant and meaningless. It's important not to simply jump to the conclusion that a nihilist is insane or that they believe in some sort of inferior mode of existence. It's not necessary that a nihilist exactly live life with a void of experience or desires. After all, doing so is effectively impossible. I mean, this is a point I briefly touched on in a previous video, but look at the concept of monks. Their general goal in life is to rid themselves of worldly desires, but depending on how we define worldly desires, the desire to rid ourselves of worldly desires, I know I'm saying that a lot, might be interpreted as one itself, given the fact that one seeks a feeling of accomplishment from doing so. Back on topic though, it's not necessary that a person simply exists doing nothing until death by believing in nihilism. For example, instead of focusing on grand goals, one might enjoy the small things about biological existence or simple pleasures rather than getting wrapped up in the struggle to find meaning. Although I say this, for those that come to realize a belief in nihilism, I can certainly see how it can be incredibly depressing to come to the conclusion that there's nothing inherently valuable about their own life or anything they care about. It can foreseeably lead to depression, indecision, and in many cases possibly even suicide as people debate the worth of life, especially a life that contains what seems like so much unnecessary suffering in the name of no greater purpose. Given that I've given a brief overview on what the belief that nothing has value suggests, and is inclined to make people behave towards, I can actually discuss how nihilism proposes this as being the case in the first place. Now, you probably noticed that I obviously left out the pretty important part on why nihilists come to the conclusion that nothing about the human experience is inherently valuable. This will typically come from the lack of any absolute existence which determines value in the first place. This obviously means that if you're religious, nihilism is of no worry to you unless you exercise it to some limited extent in concepts that are outside of the realm of which your deity defines. Because we presume there's no absolute existence, or at least presume that some divine being also has no inherent purpose, then the labels and values we apply to things in life have no real root. This is not to make the silly comment that things like physics or geometry are false, but just that in terms of the human experience, the value we apply to things like money, friendship, sex, betrayal, love, hate, fear, gluttony, and hunger are simply things that we only deem valuable because we are biologically inclined towards them or have psychologically convinced ourselves of their value. To help make sense of why these things are determined as valueless, it helps to apply a cosmic sense of thinking, being that we try to remove all emotion and biological influence in our interpretation of human life. Now that we're viewing ourselves cosmically, the very focal point of nihilism seems to be the most appropriate thing to ask ourselves now. Do we, as humans, outside of our biological preferences and perceived value of worldly and non-worldly things, have any purpose? More concisely, why do we exist? Well, it seems hard to say that we exist for any particular reason. If you're religious, then it seems satisfactory to answer this question with the response that a higher being deemed that you should and has plans for you. For the non-theist, you may seem inclined to say that of course we exist because a series of events led to life and therefore our creation. But when I say why, I don't simply mean to what ends have we occurred, but more strictly, like I said before, what's our purpose? To this end, we come to the conclusion that unless you deem your purpose as firmly rooted in a creator or something else absolute, then we have no purpose except perhaps to simply exist. But even to the end of existing, this seems cheap to say because if this is the extent to which is an individual's purpose, then it seems unnecessary to have existed in the first place considering there'd be no real difference in the grand scheme of things. So, because we have determined that without an absolute existence, we cannot really justify values as being objectively true beyond the illusion that we think they are, every value seems just as phony as the next one, leading to the conclusion that ultimately nothing's really valuable. Now that I've done what is likely a pretty shitty job explaining nihilism and how it comes around to justify itself, I can elaborate on what we might seek to learn and conclude from it. Of course, you'll likely be subscribing to the belief that no supreme being exists to follow in my upcoming logic, but I believe it can be applied in a religious setting as well, at least considering that it's permissible within your beliefs and applies to concepts which fall outside of the net that has been predetermined as inherently valuable. So, to recap before I get into my logic, we come to the general conclusion that life is valueless in the sense that, in a cosmic sense, there's no justification for our own existence, or at least certain modes of existence in a religious context. But I think that another important conclusion we can learn from the nihilistic perspective is that in a world where nothing has any value, everything by effect is equally valuable then. And it may not be equally valuable in the context of which we would typically think of two things as being equally valuable, but if everything has a value of effectively zero, then I think we can come to the conclusion that at least zero equals zero. I would say that it's an incredible misjudgment of nihilism to believe that by subscribing to the belief, whether in full or part, means that you should cease in pursuing or desiring things in life. After all, valuing an emotionless ideal to align with some depressing nihilistic perspective is just as valueless as doing the opposite. That's just the point I was seeking to make in this argument, though, that it shouldn't matter if your passion is rooted in something pointless, because there's really no difference in significance in treating it as if it is or isn't. In this case, it is just as justifiable to live life seeking friendship and happiness as it is not to do either of those things. I do hope that this sort of conclusion can help you find comfort in what you pursue in life, not focusing simply on the fact that everything might be without value, but what you might do to pursue the goals that you desire despite this fact. In any case, that's all I really have to say for now, and I also had, while I was writing the script, an unbelievably horrible idea for, an ending catchphrase. I'm gonna go ahead and say it. It's called Stay Wet, and you can let me know what you think of that, but I don't think that's gonna stick. I don't really know what I was thinking of.